stretch. We are about to begin this conversation, but before we do, as always, we want to dedicate this show to a Baltimore Black champion, and tonight we have the first Black elected U.S. Congressman in the entire nation, Mr. Perrin J. Mitchell. Perrin Mitchell and the Mitchell name stood for Black excellence in Baltimore City. No matter where you look, you saw Perrin J. Mitchell. And we're grateful that we have such a legacy here in Baltimore of Black excellence. And that we have these conversations on everything from what's happening concerning our law enforcement here in Baltimore all the way up to legislation. You cannot forget the great Perrin J. Mitchell. As always, Perrin J. Mitchell, we salute you. Thank you for the legacy of excellence and greatness that you've given to our city. So many of us have tried to pattern our lives in the space of Black excellence that was demonstrated by Perrin J. Mitchell and the Mitchell family. Without further ado, we are ready to move on into this most important topic. I'm excited tonight because the last time we had the Defund police conversation on, we pretty much had three people who spoke from an advocacy standpoint and didn't have any voice from law enforcement. Well, tonight we have a voice from law enforcement, and I get to call him brother. I don't know when I didn't know this brother. We grew up marching the streets of Baltimore in marching bands and just being in the brotherhood and fellowship. But that is the Baltimore community marching band scene. He's ascended to being one of the police officers that I can say personally has done the job right. He's a legend in the Baltimore School Police, the president of the Baltimore School Police Union, and the vice president of the Maryland State Fraternal Order of Police. I want to welcome to the Chop Shop for the very first time my friend and my brother, Mr. Clyde Boatwright.
Oh, man, thank you for having me, Brother Marvin. It's always a pleasure to see you and have conversation with you. Man, I'm excited about tonight's conversation. We get to all have some dialogue around this most important topic that's before our community today. So I really, really am glad that you invited me on.
Man, I thank you for accepting the invite because there's a lot of people in your position who don't want to come on and have these conversations, or they only want to come on when they can come on by themselves. Now I'm about to bring on my big brother, regular contributor to the Chop Shop. And somebody asked me, is he like one of your co-hosts? No, I just respect his opinion that much. But I bring him on because he's always going to get cut straight to the chase and keep it real. I got to bring on a brother who's well known for his work in West Baltimore, documented the No Boundaries Coalition. He put it on the map, and now he is the community component. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say that according to what they say, but I'm going to say he is the community component of the Baltimore City Consent Decree. I got to welcome to the Chop Shop one more time, Mr. Ray Kelly. Ray, we don't have no audio. You got to unmute that thing, man.
How's that? We good?
It's good, man. You've been trying to be muted all night. What, you don't want to talk to me?
Let me tell you, I'm in a place. I heard what you led in with earlier about what's actually happening right now. So I'm glad that this conversation now gets to move into the representation of this entity that we need to address and hopefully change.
Thank you, man, for coming on. And again, another brother who you can say has been a regular contributor. He's one of my little brothers, but definitely only in age, not in his standing, stature, and status in Baltimore as it pertains to advocacy, specifically policy advocacy. He is one of the brilliant minds that is a part, co-founder and a part of the Baltimore think tank, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I'm glad to have you back, man. You always bless the show. Y'all show some love for Mr. Dayvon Love.
Hey, appreciate for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Thank you, man. Now, this is what I need my audience to do. I need y'all to like, love, share, and comment. This is really important dialogue that's going to take place on this show tonight, man. And I want to say this up front. To have you three men agree to come together and have this conversation. It's a lot of stuff that happens behind closed doors, but you guys were willing to come and have this conversation knowing that we don't all agree on everything as it pertains to this topic, and we come from very different perspectives. I first want to say thank you guys. I love and honor the great men, the great gifts from God that you are to our community, and your willingness to come and have this dialogue. Now, that being said, I'm going to open up talking to you, Clyde, because we had a whole show around the defund police topic, right? And it was a great show. The show was more framed around the prioritization of funding towards policing versus some other things. It really wasn't a cop bashing show or nothing. It really, if be honest with you, it kind of really sent more of a message to those who are legislators than it is actual police officers. And I'm encouraged by that dialogue because we don't want the people who have to do the work to feel attacked so much, as we understand that it's a cultural issue that we're trying to work to fix. Having you come on tonight, right? I want, from your perspective, you to kick us off around the whole defund police conversation from the perspective of not just somebody who is someone who has 20 plus years doing the job, but someone who is a part of the state union, and you advocate for police officers.
Well, again, I'm glad that we're able to have these courageous conversations. I have the utmost respect for Brother Dayvon Love and Brother Ray Kelly. When I see those gentlemen about in the streets, it's always, a greeting. So, there's no animosity or anything like that. We are all passionate about the things that we do and representing our community. I am a Baltimore native son, and I'm born and raised here. You talked about in the lead in about how we grew up, in the music community, playing drums and things like that. So when it comes to the defunding of police, it's programs that would there are programs that would benefit, but there are three different types of or three different pillars of defunding police that it gets lost in translation. And let me explain them to you. You have the crowd that want to abolish police. They just want to get rid of all police and feel as though that the community would be better served without having police. And I think that's, far reaching, and I think it's a little extreme of a position to have, but some people live in that space. Then you also have the reform crowd that want to change the policies and procedures of the police department. And then thirdly, you have the reallocation of funds crowd that want to shift those priorities and shift the funds that have traditionally been spent on policing and spend it for other programs. And so from those three perspectives, and I'll take a shot at the reallocation of funds. Look, police officers that I talk to and communicate on a regular basis, they would like for, some assistance to come to certain types of calls. If you look at your neighborhood disputes, or, I have a relative that I let sleep on my couch and he refusing to leave. Why get the police involved in that? That's not a first responder issue. That's not a need to dial 911. That's a conflict between two neighbors or two relatives and things like that. So, we as police officers, we welcome the opportunity to have someone else deal with that so we can focus on some of the other things, such as the violent crime. If you look at mental health scenarios, in some cases, you would definitely want the police to be the first responder, because in some cases, some people have access to weapons. I can't speak on, the recent case because I don't know where it is, but it's a local case, and I try not to talk about local cases that are open. But I can paraphrase what the commissioner said during his interview, that this person that was having a behavioral crisis had 2 guns. So, that was something that was said by the commissioner. So I look at it, when you start talking about mental health services, do we want to send our mental health professionals out to be the first responders for these types of situations and have them potentially be hurt? So where's the mental health community on that? Is there a database of people ready to be dispatched to stand up and run to these calls for service for mental health? I think that it's important to understand that there is a policing component that has to be included in this, but we have to make sure that we structure it the right way.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Ray, and I know we talked earlier, and coming on the air, and you said you were kind of in a space about the whole situation that took place, and maybe not the specificity of that particular case, but Clyde just said, do we want first responders to be mental health providers when the situation is someone that's armed? Like, is there some sort of balance we need to reach? But I'm gonna give you the opportunity because we're here to have a conversation. Respond to any and everything that that Clyde said, Brother Ray.
So I feel like we continue to have this discussion about should the police be the first responder in these situations. We know that this is not what they are trained to address initially, but we also recognize that really a stranger from social services interacting with a person with guns is twice as dangerous, so to speak. And how do we address that? When we talk about defunding the police, this is the type of strategic programming we need to actually invest in. And there's always the case of the police are willing to kind of accommodate this type of response to anything that's happening, but are police departments willing to concede the funds it takes to establish these types of entities? So right now, that becomes the issue with defund the police is how do we reallocate those funds? Where do we invest in an alternative to a culture we've created over the past 50 years where everything is about policing and controlling a situation? So I get as individuals, it's easy to kind of speak on right and wrong and how we as an individual would address those issues. But now we move to a level of a union that represents a group of people. And that concession would then have to be part of the collective bargaining process. So really, I think we want empathetic indigenous police officers on the force, but from the union, those concessions on financial strains to our budget would have to come from the police department.
So, Clyde, let me swing back to you tonight, and I don't want you to think it's going to be a back and forth or anything like that, but I want you to be able to answer that, because when you start talking about the CBA, and even when we get into conversations about legislation, right, we know historically where unions and union representatives have stood. But the conversation, and I believe that I heard you say something without addressing it directly, when we start talking about the resources to equip these situations or to provide the necessary service providers, even if they're coming with police officer, even if they're coming with a police officer for the sake of safety, is the police budget being reduced to pay for these things something that a person in your particular position or union representatives who have that collective bargaining agreement to ratify, is that a side that you guys stand on or stand against?
Well, our issue is, I've been a union president for 11 years. I would love to have oversight of my police department's budget. I've never had that opportunity to have oversight of the police budget. So if my police department wants to give me control of the budget, then we can reallocate the funds to include those different things. And no union president has the ability to oversee the police department's budget. And that's where it gets a little choppy. And this is not a negative thing, but we have this thing about the FOP that we're the boogeyman. There's a boogeyman stigma about us that's put out in the media, and it's so untrue. I mean, we are the labor union that represents 20,000 plus police officers in the state of Maryland. That's what our organization stands for. Our organization stands for pay, benefits, and working conditions. Those are the three things that we focus on: pay, benefits, and working conditions. So we actively lobby just like any other organization or any other group with our local legislators, and we have those types of conversations. So to answer your question in short, We do not have control over police budgets. And if a police chief would like to give his union president control of the budget, I'm sure that they will welcome it.
So, Dayvon, I'm going to swing right to you. And it is a segue to come right to you in your wheelhouse, because I got to get your response to that, because Clyde essentially said the FOP does not have control over the budget. But I know, having not been somebody that's been able to make it down to Annapolis on that day, I've heard stories as to why they may say the FOP look like the boogeyman because of some of the power tactics that happen on those days when those votes are supposed to take place. So you can respond to what Clyde said, and I'm here for all of it, because I want to hear it.
So let me do this. So there are 3 points I want to make, and the last one will get to the point that Clyde just mentioned. And even before I get to that, I want to say I actually am really appreciative of Clyde's willingness to come on and have this conversation. Because to your point earlier, Marvin, like, it's been difficult to really have public conversations with representatives of law enforcement to this level. So I just want to, just say a word of appreciation for that. So number one, when we talk about police abolition, like, one thing that's important for people to note is that Western civilization stands in stark contrast to the history of the world and the level of incarceration and police that this society has. The United States is 5% of the world's population, but has a quarter of the world's prison population, right? Now, in talking about police abolition, we're not talking, or at least me, right, and folks that are kind of in my networks of advocacy, we're not talking about abolishing police tomorrow or next year, right? But the reason why the reason why we talk about police abolition as an ultimate goal, as a frame, is because it's important for us to recognize that there are societies that existed that did not need the level of crime and punishment and the apparatus of punishment that this society has. And that should be our goal. Like, that should be the North Star. So that's one. Number two, as we talk about, the issue of the power that the FOP has, it's important to note the history of the Fraternal Order of Police. The Fraternal Order of Police is not just the individuals that are members of the organization, but there are politics that precede the FOP, right? That precede the individuals, rather, that are in the FOP, that are important to keep track of. So, for instance, in the 1972 congressional record, there was the Church Commission, where there were a disclosure of the ways in which local law enforcement participated in COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, a program of the federal government where they collaborated, right, with local law enforcement to disrupt social movements. We have Eddie Conway, right, Baltimore Black Panther, who was a political prisoner for 44 years. The Church Commission disclosures identify the ways in which local law enforcement participated in that. When you look at the 1976 Mondale Commission that was put in the federal record that essentially documented the relationship that local law enforcement had with many of the national agencies, the FBI, CIA, and other agencies that were involved in undermining the Black liberation movements. So that history is important. And when we look at the contemporary FOP, they continue politically to stand on the side of not freeing political prisoners, right? So they stood in support, for instance, a few years ago, in upping the bounty for Asada Shakur that's in Cuba, right? Continuing kind of demonization of Black freedom fighters that challenge the political status quo, and the police have pretty consistently been kind of the ideological and political arm of doing that work. Lastly, on the history of the FOP, and I think it's really important, as we talked about the last time, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights was something that was established in Maryland, right? It was one of the first places to establish it. And when you look, and they had a conference the year afterwards on the Eastern Shore for states around the country, fraternal orders of police around the country, to address how they deal with Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights in terms of expanding it throughout the country. When we look at the data, right, around policies and practices that would advance policing reform, so whether it's the 21st Century Task Force of the Obama administration, right, where many of the reforms that myself and others have put forward were supported by federal government studies on what would reform police, including civilian participation in discipline, for instance. The FOP has always stood in stark opposition to those kinds of policies. And when you talk to elected officials in Annapolis, now I think their power has weakened some over the past couple of years as a result of the gun trace task force and just the kind of public mainstream of issues of police brutality. So their power has diminished. But there was a time, and I've heard legislators say off the record, they won't say in public, but I've heard many of them say off the record that if the police unions don't support it, then we don't move on it because of the level of power that they've been able to have. And then last point I want to make in terms of defund police and reallocation of resources. I think it's important. So the FOP does not control the budget, right? That's the mayor and that's the mayor and the city council, but principally the mayor and in the system that we have in Baltimore City. But see, here's the important thing is that I had a conversation with a gentleman he's in his 80s now. And I'm actually going over his house tomorrow. It's a part of a network of mental health professionals in Baltimore in the 70s and 80s. And one of the things he says he has the documents for it. He actually is someone who was mentored by Walter Carter. And one of the things that he says is there was a time when 911 got a call and it was something that wasn't deemed life-threatening, that they were dispatched, right? No matter what time of day, that they were dispatched as opposed to police. So the idea of dealing with issues that because police should be the last resort. So the idea of dealing with, small conflicts, the example that was given earlier, somebody won't leave the house. How do you get them out? Those are things that Baltimore has had in the past, structures that could do that job that police don't have to do. What I was told, and again, like I said, I'm going to the gentleman's house. He says he's got the documents and I'm looking forward to putting them out there. But what he says is that when the federal government stopped funding that function, instead of the state or the city picking it up, there was a decision made to just continue funding police, right? That's William Donald Schaefer, right? Who was the mayor at that time that made that decision. So it's important to note that the reason the police are having to play all these different roles that they shouldn't play, and I think the brother Clyde would admit that there's some things that make sense for police officers not to respond to, right? The reason we're in this current situation is because a political decision was made when the funding was cut to just have police do it. So defunding police is not nearly as radical, I think, as some kind of in the public mainstream deem it to be. It's actually going back to some of the things that Baltimore and I imagine other cities were doing before really the emergence of mass incarceration in the police state to be at the pinnacle that it is now.
So, Clyde, I want to come back to you, and I want to frame this conversation this question a little differently for you, because we talk in advocacy whenever we talking about a union of any sort, right? Is there a policy or legislative agenda? Because this is the way that I see it, right? I used very specific language during this last instance of a local uprising where I kept saying I did not want our Baltimore police officers, school police officers, or any other local entity to be put at risk by agitators and people outside the city. I really believe that Baltimoreans who chose to join in the protest joined in good faith and good spirit, but we know what could happen. So protecting our city meant protecting our police officers. I'm very specific. I put it out there. I'm one of the 3 co-founders of an organization called Reconcile Baltimore. This organization is specifically brought together to heal the relationship between Baltimore police and the citizens of Baltimore. We don't say police and community relation. We say police and citizen relation because a strong community includes its police. So, Clyde, I want to say this. Is there a policy or is a legislative agenda? Because if I'm hearing you, Dayvon and Ray, correctly, sending our police officers in certain situations puts them, their careers, their livelihood, and their families at risk. And it seems as though the politicians or the elected officials are the ones who kind of keep that situation going. We know that it's an economic conversation, but does the FOP, and you're at the state level, is there a policy agenda or legislative agenda to change the fact that police are being sent into situations as law enforcement officers that they're completely unequipped to deal with?
So we have had a few internal discussions, and unfortunately, due to the pandemic that we're dealing with, it has hurt us from meeting as regularly as we would normally do. We've missed quarterly conferences and meetings, monthly meetings at the local level for our legislative agenda to start to be drafted. So to answer your question in short, no, we don't have a certain agenda put together right now. And before I move on a little bit deeper into this to that question, I want to thank you and the other members. Like I remember in 2015, I remember seeing Kwame Rose, arrested multiple times during during the riots of 2015, and to this time to see when there was a conflict brewing down at City Hall, to see him turn people in, that was shooting projectiles at police officers, whether it was fireworks or anything like that. That shows a level of commitment of community that we as police officers seen, and we appreciate it. We appreciated it that you guys stood in the gap and didn't allow the out-of-town agitators. I saw people from Cleveland, Ohio, and other places that wanted to come here to destroy our city. And so we really appreciate and thank you guys for standing in the gap for that during that time, because Baltimore could have been a powder keg. We always say that we're one incident away from being back in 2015, and so thank you for that. As far as to respond just slightly to one of Dayvon's comments about the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, I want to give you guys some facts about the Bill of Rights that's not usually discussed. And it started in the 1960s and 1970s, where the police commissioners of Baltimore and other places would basically just start frivolous investigations against officers that they didn't like. The officers didn't have any kind of recourse. So in 1974, the first Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights was drafted in the United States, and it was drafted here in the state of Maryland by the Maryland State Fraternal Order of Police. In fact, our attorney, our counsel, general counsel, Herb Weiner, is still our general counsel now, who was the person that drafted that legislation back then. We have some founding members that are still around, Errol Crotch from Baltimore Police, so some of those guys that were here in 1974. And so when you look at the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, it's basically a guideline of how to conduct an investigation against a police officer, and it protects the interests of the citizens, the police department, and the officers, rights. It is, we talk about, and one of the changes we made in 2016 was going from 10 days to 5 days to get a statement. I can tell you now, overseeing these investigations for the last 11 years, no police chief wants to talk to a police officer within 5 to 10 days. And I'll tell you why. You get one shot at questioning or interrogating a police officer that's accused of something. You want to allow that investigation to play out, and then you can bring forth the evidence that you have and frame your questions that way when you get to the investigative stage. So what police chiefs and sheriffs won't tell you, and this is where these conversations need to be had, instead of passing it on to the FOP. Where these conversations need to be had is they are the people who pick the jury. So they bring the charges against the officer. They pick the jury as well. And then after they pick the jury of the police officers that will investigate, all a police officer has to be found guilty of is one charge. And that could be a catch-all such as conduct unbecoming. If that officer is found guilty of that one charge, they can increase the penalty or decrease the penalty, and that's called final order. That power is given to the police chiefs and sheriffs. They control the budget, which was our first question we talked about. They control the investigations, they control the trial, and they control the punishment. But all we hear about is the big bad FOP is going around protecting bad cops, and that could not be further from the truth. And again, I'm not hearing it from these two gentlemen on this panel, who I have a lot of respect for, but that's just the narrative that we hear throughout the state of Maryland. And we only are here to, nobody wants to protect bad cops. The FOP, we don't want them in our organization. We want them gone. So if there's a bad cop, we want them gone.
So when we talking about because there's a couple of things that I heard there, and I want to kind of swing this over to you, Dayvon, because Leober is one of the things that I know you as Ray also, but I know that's one of the things that you stand year after year trying to bring some reforms to. But we keep saying that the police commissioner controls the budget, right? He controls the disbursement of the funds in the agency. The budget itself is set according by the people in City Hall. Is that correct? And the reason I'm asking that question is because I get educated every time we on the Chop Show. Is that correct? Okay, I guess you know it. Yes.
So you asking me? I don't know if you was asking me or Clyde.
No, I'm asking you. Because Clyde said that the police commissioners control the budget. That's the disbursement of funds in the agency, right? So that's the after effect.
Right.
By then, the police still already have that money. They just control where it goes in the agency, as opposed to dealing with the elected officials before $500 million even get to the police department. So coming over to you, right, with that conversation about Leoba, and that does kind of frame it a little differently, and more specifically the part about being able to allow some investigation time to play out because you're dealing with somebody trained in the law to have to interrogate them. And that's a perspective that I haven't heard before. But I want you to respond to that Leoba conversation that Clyde just had, because I love the fact that we have, again, the opportunity to be educated on this show.
So two things. The first, I just want to clarify something, that the argument that is made about the FOP's role, its negative role generally in issues of police reform, when we talk about the only way that they're involved in the budget is in terms of their, over many years, their advocacy, right, around increasing the police budget. So no one's making the argument that the FOP controls the budget and that's why the budget's bloated. We're saying that and it's the case for any other interest group. That's what interest groups do. They advocate for whatever their position is. Our perspective is just that the FOP has been advocating and been successful in being able to get a outsized budget as it relates to the overall budget of the Baltimore City Police. So that's just clarifying that. Second, specifically on the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So for me, there are a couple of points to clarify in terms of where the issue is, right? Because actually, I thought the 10-day rule piece was something that I thought, I think it's problematic, and that was five business days, right? Or if there's a cause, like, so actually an extension can be given. To me, that was actually the least of the issues, right? To be honest, in terms of what the issues are for the LEOBR. I'll give you a couple of what I would argue are some of the major issues. The first is that it limits those that can be involved in an investigation of alleged abuse to sworn law enforcement officers or the governor's office or the attorney general's office or their designee, right? And what this does is that this presents problems when you're talking about folks who are investigating law enforcement that don't themselves have a professional interest in the nature of the investigation. See, the reason why we're seeing so much unrest as a result of police brutality, a lot of us in the community knew that stuff that happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others was happening all the time, right? It's just that police, given the stature of law enforcement in American civil society, right? Police, up until very recently, were understood and characterized as not being able to do any wrong in many respects, right? And so as a result of that, when a community person said an officer did something versus a police officer, the police officer, had the upper hand in that regard. And so that's why we're now seeing all these incidences because of the camera phone. Now we can see all the stuff that people have been saying for years. So the issue of sworn law enforcement and their ability to making it so that they exclusively are authorized to investigate allegations of police brutality wouldn't really make sense in any other context. And so the overarching piece of that, and again, I use that example because the overarching piece that we're trying to get to here is policing themselves has been the fundamental structural flaw in terms of how law enforcement has been conducted. If police are policing themselves, I remember in 2015 trying to advocate, and at the time people thought it was big, but we knew it was small, but I understood the kind of conceptual work it did to have community folks on trial boards. Now that's small because you got a lot of stuff that don't go to trial boards, right? And so community participation on trial boards doesn't, right? But just the conversation of non-police officers being a part of the discipline for law enforcement from the perspective of the FOP advocating against these reforms was a non-starter. It was a non-starter. Right, it was something we were told, don't even waste our time, and it only became viable to even allow for non-police officers after the uprising in 2015. Because remember, the General Assembly is January to April, right? So 2015, the uprising happened right after the session was over, right? So
Yep.
I'm talking 2015, right before when it was like nothing, with no community in discipline at all. It was only when the uprising happened that there was even an appetite for even considering, when really it should be the other way around. Is what ways can we get the community in positions with training? You know what I mean? We're not just saying put anybody in there, right? But how do you insert community in those processes and ways where community has real oversight? So that's just one example from the LEOBR. I can give one of the small examples that the officer's entitled to pretty much all the information against them when they go before the trial board, right? When the entire investigatory file. To me, that sounds like a big advantage for an officer. It's something that, kind of as a regular person, you don't get entitled to that. But I think that there are a whole bunch of things that are in the LEOBR. And I would say this: why not just negotiate it in the contract? Like, why not let the FOP in the city negotiate it? And if that is what is agreed to, then put that in the contract. It gives the residents of Baltimore the ability to use our ballot to say, this is what we want negotiated, as opposed to this essentially an unfair advantage in negotiating. To have these, and one thing, it's funny, one of the first things that it says when you look at the LEOBR is that the LEOBR, except for subtitle 2, supersedes all law. So no municipality can make a law that mitigates the LEOBR. Why give the FOP that level of advantage in negotiating? Why not just do it with the local FOP in the city? And if that is deemed to be necessary, then do it that way.
So, Ray, I want to come to you because you're with us, and Clyde, I know you would like to respond to that, and we're going to get to it. But, Ray, you here with us, and we do have the newest tool in the toolbox, as I've heard you refer to it, Baltimore's consent decree. And without really framing it, being someone that's very well versed in the consent decree and somebody that is a part of the implementation process or oversight, process of the consent decree, where does the consent decree find itself as you have this advocate these two advocates, one who's an advocate for the people and the other one who's an advocate for our police officers? How do you see this new and brightest new toy in the toolbox, tool in the toolbox fitting in there to bring really whatever you have to say? Because I don't want to say to bring unity, harmony. I want, what does the consent decree do in the midst of this conversation?
So the one thing the consent decree doesn't do is supersede state law. So for real reform implementation, there are pieces of the LEOBR and state legislation that have to be enacted so we can realize actual reform. I'll say, as a longtime reform advocate, it's commonly recognized that all of our strategizing and all of our preparation is to prepare us for the battle we'll have with the FOP at the end. Like I said, there's always officers like Clyde, and I know a lot of true-hearted brothers that patrol our city, but the FOP as an organization still carries that political power that it seems to me, and I've been back and forth legislatively for over 10 years, where in the end, even if it's something as small as redistricting, the FOP is opposed. When we talk about things like the 10-day rule that got changed, FOP was adamantly opposed, where if that is an issue of actual transparency or whatever the case may be, then that needs to be addressed through changes in the LEOBR. Like Dayvon said, only a sworn officer can investigate a law enforcement officer. It was a struggle from 2015 to 2017 to actually get voting members on those trial boards, where it was the first step was actually getting those trial boards accessible to the public, where I don't know if this is the right word, I kind of speak it as a layman, that really the police officers have been charged with policing themselves, and to us as advocates, the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights is just the outline of protection that police officers have when there is an investigation. I mean, in our best interest, there should be an autonomous investigator when there's incidents concerning residents, but that's protected in the law enforcement. I think we influenced the first change in the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights just like 2 or 3 years ago, where that time to us is the adjustments being made to policing to accommodate the civil rights movement. So we're not seeing all this officers turning on officers. We're seeing this is how officers are being protected from civil rights violations during the riots and unrest of the 60s. So I don't know how the true bearing of that timing factors in, but that's not the way we as advocates have seen the structure of the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights and how it influences all subsequent policies when we go to Annapolis.
So Clyde, I want to bring that conversation, and we're gonna keep it right here with Leoba. I'm sorry I haven't even said this, and it's very important to say, you know, you on live with the Chop Shop. We on every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. bringing the real conversations with the vital voices to the people. And I really want to stay right here with this conversation, and I want to kind of frame this out in my own way as the facilitator. You know, I always let people know that here on the Chop Shop, it's not about any political position or agenda. I never interject what my opinions are. But this one time, I want to take a little liberty and say the Jeff Shorters of the world, the Greg Eameses, the Clyde Boatwrights, not just the Mo Browns, the Cherie Briscoes, and all of that sort of thing of the world, who are not police officers or people who do the work, the Otis Daniels of the world. These are people who I love. I ain't talking about police officers, right? These are people who I love. And we saw during this most recent protest images and officials as high as the state and national level talking about how Baltimore set a new example. As you've seen the unification between citizens of Baltimore, police of Baltimore, first of all, to protect our city, and going beyond that to make sure that the narrative that came out of Baltimore is that we've grown from 2015. My question to you, when does that love and unity for those brothers that I have and that I know they have for me? Let me tell you, man, and I've talked openly about this in my moment in 2016 or 17, whenever that happened with me and the officer over in East Baltimore, Rich Gibson, Jeff Shorter, my man back then, he was Captain Jackson. So many people reached out to me that were in the command staff of BPD and said, Marvin, we know whatever it was a moment, bro. We still gonna work with you, work this thing out. And they stood by me because the love between us as human beings is real. When do we see it translate to us standing side by side as we all agree that there's a need for some legislative reforms in order for people to not feel disenfranchised as it pertains to things like Leoba?
So I think it's important to understand we have to have these type of forums where we're not yelling at each other, we're having dialogue, and we're hearing each other's side out. And there is a reason why we stand against certain things when it comes to law enforcement officer Bill of Rights. But a lot of times the public does not get to hear that, to hear why we are opposed to certain things. If we look at the LEOBR, police officers that are charged with a crime, and found guilty, or they don't enjoy the protections of a trial board. If they're found guilty of a felony, they're terminated immediately. So that is not discussed. Police officers that are when you have a trial board, let's talk about Brother Ray Kelly brought up the fight to put people on the trial, citizens on the trial board. That was a contentious fight because we wanted to our position has always been, we want to have people that are competent and trained in the split-second decision-making to be in judgment of a police officer who does not have all day long to look at a body camera footage and then make a decision. He has to make that decision in a split second. We're charged with the responsibility of taking someone's freedom, and in a split second, we have the power constitutionally to take someone's life. And that is a lot of responsibility on our police officers. Very, 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 very serious stuff. And so we have to make sure that if a person makes an error in judgment, that he's not indicted, hauled off to jail, and his family evicted because he made a split-second decision trying to protect his life or someone else's life. And so, yeah, we see incidents throughout the country where some police officers are behind the badge and they abuse that power and abuse that authority, and you don't see the FOP standing behind them. How many, not one dime was spent of FOP money defending the gun trace task force? Not one dime. But nobody talks about that because it's not newsworthy. Those guys are where they are, where they're supposed to be. They're in federal prison, where they belong. They were tried and convicted by a jury of their peers. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is the consent decree. And Ray Kelly, Brother Ray Kelly, I respect you immensely. And this has nothing to do with you. I'm talking about the overall global concern with the consent decree. There are police reform hustlers around this country, around this nation, that sell this cookie cutter product to cities like Oakland, Cleveland, Seattle, Baltimore. It's going to Atlanta next. It's going to Minneapolis next. And these are reform hustlers. They come on the cable news networks and they talk about police reform, and then they apply to be the consent decree monitoring team. And then they never step foot into a city. Fox 45 did a cover story on all of these people, 10 to 12 people that are getting paid $15,000 to $18,000 per month, living out of state to oversee Baltimore's consent decree. That's problematic, because the consent decree does not address the main problem that we have in Baltimore City, and that's the 350 murders that we had last year, the 162 that we had this year already. So as a police officer, those are the things that I'm concerned. I have been the person that a homicide detective had to call and say, hey, we have a body down here that's a John Doe, but fingerprints are probably going to identify him as your brother. So that's real to me. And we've had 162 families go through that in this city already in 6 months. We are 2 days into the 6th month of the 7th month of the year, and we've had families destroyed by that. So gun violence is very, very serious. I know police officers like me, we focus on the serious issues, but then we get into things like the consent decree is not a savior. It's not going to come save Baltimore in its issues. It's going to make a whole bunch of people a whole lot of money. And that's exactly what it's doing, because we will never get to meet those goalposts. It might be five years, and then they're going to move the goalposts a little bit further, and they're going to move it a little bit further, and it's going to cost the city more money and more money. What the city should have done is in 2012, when the FOP put together the blueprint for policing, they should have addressed it then. And it talked about some of the systemic issues that we have going on in Baltimore. It talked about the training and recruitment of police officers and the retention of police officers, and not lowering the standards, which has been done in the last 3 years. The standards are now lower to become a police officer. So we were adamantly against that, but nobody talks about that. And again, this is not a shot at the two brothers on this panel. Nobody gives the FOP the credit for saying, no, we shouldn't lower the standards. We should increase them so we can make sure that we have a better quality of police officer out there, because right now we're all picking from the same pot.
Dayvon?
Yeah, so a couple, let me say a few things. I'll start with actually a point of agreement about the reform hustlers piece. That's real. And that's one of the things that I know I've been very frustrated with, which is the way in which, and this isn't even just policing, but just in terms of issues facing, I mean, LBS, I think, is pretty well known for our critique of the way in which people profiteer of the suffering of Black people. I got to take issue, though, with when you talk about the FOP and some of the good things that it has done. The FOP is an organization where there has been undisputable evidence of the connection between white nationalist elements and the FOP as an institution. Right? There are members of the FOP and splitter groups of the FOP that were supportive of George Zimmerman in Florida, right? That were supportive of the officers that killed Eric Garner in New York City, right? And the FOP, because we can't escape, and this goes to the second thing, the last thing I want to say, which is that, Marvin mentioned a bunch of folks that I also respect as people, right? We have to understand that we're talking about institutions, right? And the culture of institutions, and how that culture then perpetuates a reality where, among other areas of civil society, law enforcement undermines and undermines the humanity of Black people. And that the FOP has never, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the FOP has never made significant efforts to address the issue of police brutality as an institution from the perspective of understanding racism and white supremacy as a fundamental part of how that dynamic perpetuates itself. The FOP does not talk about the issues of white supremacy and how it operates, even though at this point now it's pretty mainstream. I remember even 5 years ago, people had a hard time talking about that, but now we're at a place where people will talk about the real ways in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness impact how people operate. There's studies on it. All right. And I think the first show I did with Marvin, I kind of identified there's some studies that have been done that look at the way in which that impacts police officers' behavior. The FOP, and I went through the history in the beginning, has never disavowed that history of staying against the Black freedom struggle, right? And doing things to be disruptive, right, to those who are fighting for our people, right? When you think about many of the political prisoners that today remain in prison and others that were in prison for many years, right? They stand behind those folks being behind bars. And so it's one thing to say, that for you, but there may be things that you have done as an individual that are good for folks in Baltimore. But when we talk about the FOP as an institution, its history has been so marred with destruction and policy advocacy against Black people that the goodwill of a handful of individuals doesn't make up for that. And the FOP is going to have to do way more than some of the efforts that you and a handful of other folks do to make up for the damage that the FOP has done to Black people in the United States. And again, the history on this point, both recent history and further history, is just indisputable on this point.
So you on Live with the Chop Shop. I'm your host, Pastor Marvin McKinstry. We come to you live every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. on Facebook via StreamYard. I got to swing to you, Ray, because, when I talk about you, big bro, I always call you Mr. Consent Decree, and not because of any unholy or unrighteous attachment to it, but just how you have kind of dove in head first. And to hear you come on first and foremost, bro, and say that when it comes down to the legislative reforms that are necessary, even for the reforms that the consent decree is supposed to bring into place to matter, we've got to see that level of change. And I want you to respond to, and I know you either took some mental or you may have even took some copious notes on what Clyde was saying. Can you respond to Clyde as a person who works within the framework of the consent decree to help bring change to Baltimore? You got to unmute yourself, bro.
So just to amend what Dayvon said, this messaging piece that we get from the FOP as we continue to advocate for reform plays a big part. Now, just like you, I know all those officers you named and probably 50 more that I can name, where when someone asks me, what does a good police officer in Baltimore look like, I'm like you, I can say names. But when we talk about actually reforming the police and perception and power demonstrated by the FOP, we can only think of comments from the FOP's president, going back to the kids in the East Point situation or wherever the mall where the kids ran wild for a minute. These are criminals and treat them as such, where this is the messaging that this organization is given to its members, and it's also the perception that this organization continues to give to the residents. So we know that the consent decree is not a panacea or a silver bullet, but it's a tool that we need to use, and it's a federal order. So why should not the fraternal order of police be in support of actually accomplishing those mandates. I mean, the argument with the hustling of who's on these monitoring teams is outside of my purview, where everybody knows I was intricate in the monitor selection process, and like everybody else, pissed off and disappointed the way it wound up. And I'm thankful that I still have access to this process as part of this current monitoring team, and I still advocate to the best of the community I come from in those rooms. So if that be the hustle, we have to recognize that this is a federally mandated and enforceable document that we should be trying to accomplish and get beyond, but still the rhetoric and support of the representation of the officers is such a gift from Mancuso.
So you on Live with the Chop Shop. We come to you live every Tuesday and Thursday on Facebook via StreamYard. I got some powerful sisters that are checking in right now. Sister Karen York. I'm actually sitting here with one of my favorites. I got Cat Bird over here, just sitting like a bird on my shoulder, talking in my ear. And I see Monica Cooper, one of BPD's finest. I thank God for the diversity of this audience. And Clyde, I want to come to you now because we're hearing terms like the culture of policing, right? And again, as I always say, and you and I have had some offline conversations where we have saluted each other for the individual work that we do. But when we get past that, that what a good police officer looks like, because you're one of the people that if I had to pull and carve out somebody that has done the job the right way and has led the way as an example of what's possible in police officers, that's still the conversation about the culture of policing. You, as a Black man from Baltimore, born and raised for as long as for all I know, you are a native Baltimorean who has chose to, like Ray, in your own way, be a part of what change can look like. Talk to that conversation as a vice president of the FOP over the state of Maryland, as a lifelong Baltimorean who hears and understands the heart of Baltimore through the voice of advocates and through the people. How does it find you? What does it say to you when you, Clyde, Boatwright, DP, Baltimorean, hear that conversation of a corrupt culture? How does it make you feel? What do you say to that?
So I think about when I hear culture, and I always hear the commissioner from Baltimore always say something about the culture. We have to change the culture. And I think back, I think back to scenarios and situations that I've been in over the last 20 years, and I've seen most of the things that you would see as a police officer in the city of Baltimore. I've pretty much seen it all. And I think about maybe if there's someone who has an intention to do something to another person, they're smart enough to not do it around me. So because they know that I'm not going to stand for that, I'm not going to allow that. We're not going to violate people's civil rights. We're just not going to do that in my presence. And that's the reason why I got into being a part of the union, is because my rights as a police officer was violated for something that I really didn't even do. And it was like I was the person that actually violated the person's rights was protected by the sheriff of Baltimore, and I was thrown under the bus, and I had to fend for myself and try to learn how to, try to find another way to feed my family. And I was eventually blessed enough to get back into policing a short time later because everybody saw the truth and saw the facts. So I will say this, it is a struggle to see some of the things that we see in the city of Baltimore and not have everybody on the same page. Again, from a labor perspective, a union perspective, I don't want to represent somebody I know is a bad cop and try to keep them on the job. I want them out of there. And I'm not going to represent somebody that's against my morals and values. But we also got to sometimes address the red elephant in the room. What is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a person in Baltimore, and it's not an encounter with the police officer. It's encounter with somebody who's not going to face any consequences for anything that they do. And that is the main problem, and that's the one sticking point that I stay on a daily basis, is the violent crime in cities across America, especially in Baltimore. Those are the things that I focus on. And when it's time to deal with labor issues, we deal with days off, we deal with attendance problems, we deal with all kinds of stuff like that. But and to bring this on home, we have in Baltimore the ability for people to come to trial boards and things like that and see them. You know, they're not widely attended. Like, everybody that wanted to come see a trial board, when it was talked about, people don't attend them. And we have not had one time someone to request the training that is required to be a civilian to sit on a trial board through the Police Training Commission. Not one person has requested that training. No names have been submitted. And you would have saw that last week when they had the legislature had that training Zoom meeting talking about the police or policing in America, chaired by Delegate Vanessa Atterbury. When the training commission did their presentation, nobody has requested the training in the state to have civilians sit on a trial board. If a civilian is going to sit on a trial board, they have to, and be in judgment of a police officer, they should at least know exactly what they're doing and understand what the policies and procedures are. And again, I say it again, chiefs and sheriffs leave us at the altar because they write the policies. They write policy. So everything we've talked about today, they write the policies, they distribute the budget. These are not union things. You know, we could say that you don't, you know, if a chief says that tomorrow you have to wear pink socks, that's the policy of the day, and we have to wear pink socks or we violate policy. So let's put it where the ghost can get it, as the old folks say, and let's talk about the reality of things going on. It's not always a union thing that we're protecting bad people. And I, for one, don't witness it in my space, because I will address it. And the officers that I know and work with, they will address it as well.
Hey, brother, can I deal with some of that for a second?
Go ahead.
Yeah, hold on. I wanted to make sure, because I know it froze on my end. I wanted to make sure if Clyde had anything else that we, because it would seem like a very little pause, but I wanted to make sure that we got the clarity of your thought out so that we can go to Dayvon. And Dayvon, were you good, Clyde? Okay, come on, Dayvon.
So just a few things. One, on particularly the piece around, you know, violence in Baltimore, right? You know, violence, intra-communal violence. It's important. Two things are important there. The first is that, as we've talked about on previous shows, the level of investment in law enforcement and the outcomes we get should make it clear that the current approach to law enforcement doesn't effectively address the situation. So some of the alternatives that we discussed are ways to get at that, right? So that's one. The other piece, though, is that Baltimore City Police Department has a low clearance rate. In addition to the issues of transparency around police brutality, I also think that these reforms have public safety implications as well. Because when you have officers, right, who don't expect to be disciplined, right, or they don't expect that people are going to pay attention, and if they feel like, you know, they have a good relationship with the higher ups, right, so they're not likely to be looked at. And so when you have just really that lack of transparency, then you don't have the same urgency to be able to address the issue of homicide. And I think a part of when you read the 2016 Department of Justice report, in addition to, you know, brutality, you also find a lot of incompetence, right? And there are a bunch of reasons why, you know, we can discuss where that, you know, where that incompetence arises from. But there's a lot of incompetence on a lot of basic things that are important to be able to address the public safety issue, even if I were to concede that, you know, policing is going to get us there. So it's important that when we talk about this issue of reforming police reform and defunding police, that we're talking about this in the context of public safety as well, right? That both police brutality and violence, you know, intracommunal violence is important, and that reforming law enforcement helps us to address both of those things as well. And so it's just really important that we make that point, so that we're clear. Because I think sometimes what happens is those who are advocating for police reform are characterized as not caring about the violence that's happening in the community, when in fact, those are both issues that are related, that matter, that require, different kinds of work. But the laws that impede the ability to have transparency make it difficult to be able to hold police officers accountable for the job of doing public safety. And I want to emphasize again, when we talk about like the culture of policing, like what we learned from the gun trace task force is that there was a culture that allowed that to happen over a period of time. It wasn't just like it happened a couple times and it was a culture that allowed that to happen, right? And that there was a period of time when there are new revelations that come out where a few months ago another officer was indicted, right? So when we talk about culture, that's a very real thing, right? You as an individual, again, may be an upstanding person, but when it comes to the culture, what is people's expectations in the police department? And I would argue from conversations that I've had with some of the people that you all mentioned, that they would say that a part of the issue within the police department is that if you got a good relationship with higher ups, right? And that there's a culture where we don't let people on the outside know what's going on. That's it's a matter of policy. That's the fundamental issue that we got to get to, and that deals directly with culture.
Ray Kelly, I want to come and swing to you because right after I give you the opportunity to speak on this, I got a question that I want to throw out to all of you guys as we begin to wind it up. But Ray, I want you to go ahead and jump in right where we are, and whatever it is that you want to add to this topic or to where we are right now as we talking about culture, because I'm hearing some parallels as we talk, as Clyde would talk about the culture that's producing murder in our city, and then Dayvon is talking about the culture that's produced the gun trace task force and other things that make many people feel as though there's great need for police to reform, or the culture that produced a report from the DOJ that gave us a consent decree.
Right, and I don't want to lose the point that Dayvon listed, that most of us in this advocacy field are there and passionate because we advocate for people in a community, and our initial focus and our organizational focus is always based on how we do this work and how we save lives. So for us, those two are not mutually exclusive. So as much as I know, to have effective policing, you need data, you need input from community members to actually solve these crimes. There should be an intentional effort as well to build these viable mechanisms to actually get to that point. So just like we talk about, there's a culture of corruption, there's multiple other avenues where the police department and the community just don't and haven't historically interconnected. So it's important that the messaging from the representation of the entirety of policing in Baltimore City is not saying that these advocates are anti-policing, when you, Clyde, know that we're here trying to save our kids and we got to actually deal with this stuff. So we're still impacted by every instance of violence that happens on our street, and we are searching and working for a viable mechanism to bring that number back down. So the consent decree doesn't supersede any of the laws that you enforce. It just ensures that when you do those laws, for lack of a better term, you do them in a constitutional manner. And in my purview, that's the first step of building trust. So if we're actually talking about reducing crime, reducing violence, the people in these communities actually need someone to talk to that they can trust. As long as there's this adversarial approach, when we get to that point of this has to change, the people at the ground level still suffer. So we are impacted by 167 homicides directly. I've been to a lot of funerals this year where, I don't know, I take exception to those type of comments because that's a generalization of a community where you know me. You know I'm in those rooms. You know I'm in every conversation. But Marvin also knows that every day I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm dealing with the drug epidemic. I'm dealing with the violence epidemic. You know my reputation with police. And so long before Freddie Gray, I was mediating those conversations so people can feel safe. So we know that there's been viable mechanisms in Baltimore City and not far. Remember, in Western District in 2014, we only had 21 homicides. That was from collaboration, support from different agencies, so the community could actually do the work of policing itself. We cleaned up our own streets, which is the definition of policing. And those are the type of initiatives that demand a depletion of the overall budget for policing so we can build trusting relationships and actually increase public safety and not just perpetuate policing.
You on live with the Chop Shop. We get ready to come down the stretch, and I want to just say a little bit about what Ray just said, because last week, myself and some other men of faith in Baltimore, and this is one of the things that I really don't talk a lot about, we went into our pocket to buy a young man's freedom from a debt that could have cost him his life. So there's many different places and on many different levels where work is happening, and I'm talking literally. This happens more than it's ever publicized. I don't talk a lot about it because I don't want to violate the trust of those on the ground level in the communities who are willing to come and say, man, look, they're going to kill me, or they want to do some harm to my family. But these are some of the things that happen. And when I hear people who say that, you know, there's, because we also care about police brutality, there's no concern for what's happening with the violence in Baltimore, that's just absolutely not true. And I'm talking way beyond the people who are doing work in institutions. I'm talking about having on many occasions to put my money where my mouth is to make sure that if a young person wants some freedom from that game, his life can be preserved. And then the heartbreak in many cases where I got to pray at a visual or preach a funeral because we didn't get to that young person in time. So as we coming down the stretch, I got a question that I want to throw at the three of you guys. And I thank everybody for coming on. I'm going to say a little bit more of my thank yous, but the question is this, okay? From the perspective of being Clyde Boatwright, Ray Kelly, and Dayvon Love, and I want to start with you, Ray. We know where we are in the sense of this, as you put it, adversarial conversation that we tend to continue to have. Where do we need to get to? FOP, Baltimore citizen, Baltimore advocate, where do we need to get to? I told y'all I started a 501c3 called Reconcile Baltimore. Call it the pastor in me or whatever, but I believe that there's some reconciliation that has to happen where we tap into the humanity, whether you wear a uniform or whether you advocating in the communities of Baltimore. It has to come back to being human beings. Ray, talk to me about where we are as opposed to where we need to get to.
So I think, Marvin, you sat with me in a conversation before where really we took that first step of sitting down and having a face-to-face conversation with the previous president of the police union. And we kind of discussed a resident grassroots perspective on civilian oversight and actually didn't have this broad projected organizational type gathering, but 4 or 5 men sitting in a room keeping it real. And I think it all starts with that conversation. And with Gene or the next president not really engaging in that way, we kind of have to go back to that. We have to actually have conversations like Clyde said. We have to be civil and make each other understand us, like you said, from a human perspective. Return humanity to these conversations and just remove that language of officers and civilians and start sitting down in rooms with first names.
powerful. And one of the things that sticks out for me from that meeting, as I'm getting ready to come to you, Clyde, with the same question, we literally sat down with Gene Ryan in the room and discussed these things. Somehow, I don't know, I believe it was just God kind of had me in the lead on the conversation, because I wasn't even the chair of CODIF anymore at this point. All Gene Ryan knew, and anybody that remembers the encounter with myself and the police officer, the last thing that happened, even after I kind of gave my first public statement, was that the FOP came around for another wave, looking for their pound of flesh. We sat down in this room and had a conversation. I got up to go to the bathroom. Gene Ryan leaned to somebody in the room and said, I didn't even know that was Marvin McKinstry. Everything that I thought about him from that video and from that situation, I now realize that is a great young man, because we had the opportunity to get from behind our podiums. And that's what I love about the Chop Shop. We have so many opportunities where we see people in official capacities come behind the podium. We got to get from behind the podium and come into the room and sit down. As Ray just said, Clyde, where are we, whether it's as a FOP vice president, as a police officer who loves Baltimore, a black man? How do we get to the place to where we have more of, well, we see the healing? I don't want to suggest anything. I want to hear from you.
So I think it's important do exactly what Brother Ray Kelly just said. We got to have the conversations. We got to use mediums like this to come together and hear each other out. I told you the other day when we talked on the phone briefly, I love various quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, and he had a quote that I live by. If we all in the room agree, then somebody's not needed. And I think that comes from a space where we have to be able to understand our differences. And from what I'm hearing from Dayvon and Brother Ray Kelly, we all want the same thing. But how we get there, how we all get to the same location is coming from a different route. Do we want excellence in policing? Yes. Do we want safer communities? Yes. I think, their work in the community have shown that they want the same thing that we want. But, the most important thing that we have to do from a police perspective is we have to, like Brother Kelly said, is humanize and normalize things. We have to humanize policing again, because what happens is people feel as though police officers are robots and that they can't make any mistakes. They're human beings. There's a level of that where people can make mistakes. And that is not, you don't lose that ability to make a mistake when you swear an oath and strap on a gun and a badge and go jump in a patrol car and race up and down the street lights and sirens. You can make mistakes. And to Brother Dayvon's point earlier, talking about the low clearance rate in Baltimore City, that comes from a divide between communities and policing, and people don't want to come forward with information because they fear as though that they are putting themselves in jeopardy. When we get back to a place where people can comfortably tell police officers that it was Joe Jones that did it, and I don't want that person in my community that can brutally kill somebody. When we get back to that place, then we can start to really start to see more of a murder rate. And I'll give a shout out to a lot of my friends that are homicide detectives that, those guys are second to none. And if there's ever a dead body, you would definitely want a Baltimore City homicide detective standing over top of you to solve the case, because they know exactly what they're doing. And it's also a shout out to the other hospitals and things like that, such as, shock trauma and Sinai and Johns Hopkins, for not making the homicide rate higher and making that clearance rate a little bit lower. So we got to get to the systemic issues that are in policing, such as, when we talk about the overall conversation that we had with defunding, we have to find a way to get people that are like me, that are like a Greg Ames, who you talked about earlier, like a Jeff Shorter, like those guys that come from this community to join our ranks and get involved in the process. That's what we need to do. We need to start looking at our high school students and our kids at Compton and our kids at Morgan and our kids at these local communities, at these local schools, and get them interested in this. At this point, if my son was looking for a career right now, I would tell him absolutely not. He couldn't be a police officer. My youngest son, we have a deal. The day that he decides that he wants to be a police officer, we're going to drive to a local field and we're gonna fight. And if he beat me up, he can go to the academy. And if I win, he can't. Because that's just the reality. I don't want him in it, because we got to make this a career field again where there's trust, or that the community trusts us, and that we can also have these courageous conversations. And I think it starts with you here. And I'm glad that I had an opportunity to participate.
So Dayvon, I'm gonna come straight to you and let you respond to the question.
Yes, sir. So a few things. The first is that, as you know, people who know me know, I'm Black first, and what that means is that I'm going to sit down and talk with Black folks, because I see us to be a family, and I think all of our interests are closely aligned. We all have a mutual interest in each other's well-being and existence. That being said, it's hard for me to go along with the vision of, a solution rooted in everybody just coming down and sitting together. Like, when I think about the FOP, until I see Black folks within the FOP challenge the white nationalist and racist policies and rhetoric of the Fraternal Order of Police, that institution is not an institution that Black people should embrace, right? And that we have to be clear that when an institution's at war with us, we cannot be foolish enough to not believe that, even though they may have some of our folks inside, that institution won't continue to be at war with us, right? That Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that it's important for Black people to develop the mechanisms of power to protect our interests. So it's not just a question of people getting along. This was the mistake that people make in terms of how to read the history of Black people, that it's a history of white people being mean to Black people. And if only people just were able to be nicer to each other and talk to each other and see each other one-on-one. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't useful efforts of collaboration in certain situations, right? So, if you got a program where you want to bring people together and talk to police officers, I don't think that's necessarily something that's a bad thing. But we cannot root our solution to this problem in dialogue. It's about building the power as Black people to build the institutional capacity that the FOP, that the Maryland General Assembly, the Democratic Party, is afraid of crossing Black people. See, right now, the consequences for hurting Black people politically are not high enough that people really consider it. And it's only when we have moments of national media moments or moments of unrest where people really start to really watch their steps and say the kind of things that folks need to say. And again, this ain't necessarily Clyde, because Clyde is consistent, right? But I'm talking about the people who don't speak on these issues, right? People who represent police officers who, before it was a national media event, didn't care and had no regard for it. It's important for us as Black people to rely on our ability as a community to wield the instruments of power to make law enforcement do what it needs to do in terms of our community. And I think, like I said in the beginning, ultimately, a community that is safe doesn't necessarily need police. Police should be the last resort. That we need to move to a vision of law enforcement where police at most are periphery, right? Certainly not central, right? And I think that's a vision of police that I actually think is pretty intuitive. I think most people find it intuitive to have a vision of public safety where police are the last resort, if at all. And so I would hope that in terms of our conversations, that becomes really the line, right? That we need to, as Black people, have the line to say, look, we want a community where we determine what the vision for public safety is. Not the FOP, not the Democratic Party. We determine what that vision is. And I think that it's only when we do that we can really have honest conversations that aren't paternalistic, that aren't people promising us stuff that is never going to happen, right? Without people saying, yeah, we don't get to that, we don't get to that. No, we need to build the power so that when we go to the table, it really means something. I think that's where we got to reach the solution.
Again, you on Live with the Chop Shop. I want to thank all of my guest panelists for coming on tonight, but I do want to honestly say this didn't wind up being a defund police conversation. It wound up being a policing in America conversation that touched on so many of the broader issues that impact policing. And to be honest with y'all, I don't think that we're done with it. As I told y'all, I'm here with one of my good friends, a real powerful sister in her own right. And she talked about the patriarchy that's at work in policing. So we want to continue this conversation, and we're going to have to bring some of the sisters on. I seen Karen York on here. I'm right here with Catalina Bird. And I think that the next level of this dialogue is one where we're going to need to come to the table and be able to further the discussion around solutions, because a lot of the things that were hashed out today, to me, seems that there's some parallel areas of concern that I'm just grateful to God that he gave me the opportunity on this platform to finally bring some of those voices together. And I believe that the community conversation that took place tonight is something that can really drive us forward. I want to be able to have you guys back sooner than later, because this is an ongoing conversation, and I want to challenge you, if you for my guys that are on here tonight, as we may be able to bring Karen York, a Cat Bird, a Jill Carter into the conversation, a solutions-oriented conversation. If you with it, tell me you with it coming back on to have a solutions-driven conversation.
Well, you know I'm there.
Absolutely.
Man,
Absolutely.
I love and appreciate you, brothers. We got a show coming up on Tuesday that's going to touch on something that's very needed. Hey, Shock, I sent it to you. I don't know if you got the artwork on it, bro. If you do, can we get that loaded up real quick? On Tuesday, we are going to go one-on-one with Senator Jill P. Carter, and we're going to be talking racial disparity and all things Baltimore. She has been very vocal on its Atlas Restaurant Group, Uzo Bay, and so many other things, but she has some perspective on defunding police, the new administration that's coming into City Hall, and just a lifelong legacy of service, not just for her, but in her family. So y'all probably already know what direction I'm gonna go with the show dedication, but we gonna sit down. Our conversation one-on-one with Sister Sheila was so powerful. We gonna sit down and we gonna give the whole show to Senator Jill Carter, because I just got accused by my sister over here. Now, let me get y'all, if you look at the logo of the Chop Shop, you see that candy stripe in there. The Chop Shop was originally designed to be barbershop conversation, but I just got accused by somebody that know me better and love me of having a patriarchal show. And she won't let me bring on the camera because she say she ain't got her right hair on the day. But we gonna have Senator Jill on today, on Tuesday, to have a real live conversation. We've been in our series on moving Baltimore forward, and we got a confirmation, not this coming week, on the 9th. On this coming week, we'll broadcast the Chop Shop, but it's going to be me as a part of another community dialogue that's being facilitated by Brother James Green. Well, actually, Stogie is going to facilitate the conversation, but I'm going to be a contributor as it pertains to what's impacting young men in Baltimore as it pertains to employment. So that's going to be the Chop Shop broadcast. Then that following Thursday, the 16th, we are going to have, and I thank God, but I'm ultra excited about our very own police commissioner, Michael Harrison, agreeing to accept the invitation to come on and to talk about what's going on in Baltimore. I promise you have my word. I'm going to continue this conversation around, because for me, it's not a policing in America. I know it goes to that larger perspective, but the Chop Shop is a Baltimore show. I want to take the opportunity to say to each one of you men, Dayvon Love, my younger brother, little brother, but only in age, not in stature and status. You know I respect you. You have been one that have educated me along the way on a lot of things that I've needed to round out and complete who God has called me to be through our city. I want to say to Clyde Boatwright, man, Chip, that's Chip to me, y'all. Chip from the baseline, Chip. I love you, brother, and I'm grateful for you agreeing to come on courageously, you know, to have the conversation and to bring the perspective that we were having a difficult time getting on, and is always the consistent one, the consummate professional and community advocate. My big brother, Ray Kelly, thank you for coming on and having this dialogue with us, man. It's important, and we're going to continue to have it. You know, before we go off the air, I got to share something from the Word of God. The greatest commandment. And it says in Matthew, the 22nd chapter, starting at around the 34th verse, hearing that Jesus has silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together and they're going to try to press up on him, right? This is me giving you my summary, right? One of them, an expert in the law, because we're having a conversation that really deals with the law, whether you're a policy advocate, whether you're a legislative advocate, or whether you're advocating on the side of the police, we're having conversations about the law. One of the experts about the law tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied this way: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. I want to leave you with the reality that as much as we want to talk legislation and everything, there has to be a rising up of the God-centered humanity that was rooted in us in our creation. Because until we learn to love people again, whether you wear a uniform, whether you advocate for people, if we do not learn the God-centered love of people, we can put all of the policies and legislation that we want on the books. We won't see the significant amount of change when we're not enumerating murders or trying to downplay instances of police brutality by talking about how many murders there are. We will get to that place where policing will become less needed because we're loving each other and bringing about the healing that is possible to our people. As always, I got to thank my main man, my right hand, my left hand, Mr. Shaka Pitts, for making all the magic happen on the screen. And tonight, Shock, we had some rock stars with us. We had Nika Namdi. We have always my favorite, Mother Pearl Sanders. We had Karen York with us tonight. We had another sister who was putting some really powerful comments in there and just going in. I want y'all to remember our Black Business Spotlight, Tony's Miracle. Look them up on Facebook. Get some help if you're trying to grow a little something. I ain't found the miracle part to grow this part back yet, but I believe God that she's working on it so I can get me a little top piece. I ain't blessed like Ray to be 50 and still got, some top piece. I love you, Baltimore.
Sound like hate.
I was straight hating on you, bro. The reason we had the top shop and we had these conversations is because I love Baltimore that much. Thank you, Baltimore, for tuning in, for making us relevant, and for always hanging out with a Shock. There's only one thing left to say. KS, take me home.
I can be more.
I'm gonna call you right back, son.
More. You can make every dream a reality. We can be more. Be more, be more.
Yeah.
I can be more.
I wake up every day and try to be more. I pray I be more. It's easy to achieve anything you believe. Like hold your head high. Girl, you got a reason to breathe. I see a rare mind. Boy, you got a reason to dream. Let's take flight. Get the children a reason to see redemption. We grow up in the jacks where it's evil and wicked. Where the people with success don't want to send you a visit. But we still finna make this life worth living. Now throw your hands to the sky if you feel it. Hey, throw your hands to the sky if you the realest. You got a vision. Let's put them pistols away and make sure the OGs keep the community safe. In the world where the ladies crying, the babies dying, I think we can create that space to make a way for the ladies to ride and make baby giants. Be more, believe, let's play. I'm so in love with life.